Today, joining us on Smuggling Hope, today's guest is someone who challenges the way we think about health from the ground up, literally down to the physics of light, water, and magnetism. Dr. Jack Kruse is a neurosurgeon turned health visionary who his work has shaped and reshaped the conversation on how the environment, both sunlight, circadian rhythms, cold, and even the way our cells make water, directly impacts our mental health, resilience, and
Biggest
human
fan.
performance. He's the author of The Epi Paleo Prescription, the founder of Optimized Life, and he has been a relentless voice calling us to reconnect with nature's blueprint for optimal living. So, if you've ever wondered why morning sunlight can lift your mood, how the cold plunges can rewire your brain, or why seafood could be maybe one of the most underrated antidepressants, this conversation is going to open your eyes. So, Dr. Kruse, welcome to the show, and it's an honor to have you here today. Thank you, sir. So when somebody says the biophysics for mental health, like what picture should they have in their mind, you think?
I mean, it's a broad question. I mean, everything about health is tied to those three metrics that you mentioned in the opening, which is like water and magnetism. It's kind of like the opening of Genesis. You know, when people told you let there be light, it's kind of like you got the answer, but you need to figure out the recipe.
Mhm.
And that's kind of what that answer is about. You need to know a little bit of a lot of things to make sense of it. The key thing to know, especially if you're a modern human and you have, the mental health issue, is that the solution for the doctors, the centralized doctors, is pharmaceuticals, which is fraught with failure. In fact, you look at the literature, about 55% of people who use the drugs wind up failing. So there's got to be a better answer. So the better answer is, if you're, a first principle thinker, you dive deep. And what you find out is everything about the nervous system. Electricity. But the electricity starts first with light, and how to make that electricity that goes through our frontal lobes, that goes through places that cause most of those mental illnesses, is where I guess you would call it the cornerstone of foundation of health begins, where good cognition, good consciousness begins. So, so you can stave off of all the mental illness. And that begins with melanin, is a pigment that I think most people know about, but what they don't know about it is that melanin absorbs all frequencies of light. And
Okay.
then from that pathway that it absorbs the light, when it gets hydrated by mitochondria, because our mitochondria make water, it decreases its electric capabilities. And where mental health is eliminated in terms of bad disease is that current has to be about 1 trillionth of 1 ampere throughout the neurologic system. And this is, say, we'll go the other way. Say places where it's absent, where that 1 trillionth of ampere is gone, then you get low dopamine state, you get things like mood disorders and depression. You go the other way and say the melanin gets dehydrated because your mitochondrial function stinks. Then you end up with a disease called schizophrenia, which is chaotic. Why? Because it's extremely high and it's not released in a circadian fashion. In other words, when the neural structures need it, you're not able to maintain that tension, in that neural tract, and you wind up with another disease. And the interesting part of those diseases, where I pick those as the starting point for you, is that you can see these are dopamine problems, but very different. One is low dopamine, the other one is high dopamine, and very chaotic. And that's what makes biology extremely difficult, for normies to understand, because there's a lot of different nuances on a spectrum. And it turns out that that spectrum is the electromagnetic spectrum. Most people, when they hear the word spectrum, they think you're going to start talking about autism. The light spectrum is really the key in understanding how, this thing is put together, and how melanin is the motherboard for, I guess you'd want to say, the hardware, which is our brain. Then you begin to understand a new way that cognition is built, and the mental awareness is built.
Okay. Well, so I guess as we're talking about this, I guess if we improve the physics around a person, right, the light especially, like how, like I guess how quickly would like mood and cognition you think like tend to change?
It
Because like you said,
depends.
like there's a whole lot of complexity involved.
Yeah, it depends on the hole you're in. Your question subsumes that every person that has depression is the same. They're not. They're on a spectrum too. Everybody who has schizophrenia are the same. They're not. They're on the spectrum. Why? Because your mitochondrial heteroplasmy, which is how much CO2 and water you make is also on a spectrum. So the answer to that question depends where you are. Are you close to health and just a little bit in malhealth, or are you in a deep hole, where you're ready to kill yourself? But the answer to those questions would be radically different for those people.
Well, so when you're talking about like the spectrums of mental health presentation in terms of the symptoms, in terms of the presentations, like whether it's depression or schizophrenia or a lot of the things that we diagnostically like, maybe we'll medicate or we'll intervene with, a lot of times people don't understand like the function of mitochondria. I mean, they haven't thought about mitochondria since like maybe a sophomore year of high school biology. Can you explain to the audience kind of like why and how come mitochondria is such a big part of the mental health picture for people?
Pretty simple. Mental health is uh, a system brownout in certain neurocircuits. What mitochondria do is they provide a 30 million volt charge to the system, and then that charge has to be directed, downregulated, and then delivered through the neural tracts. And that's true not just with the neural tracts, but it's also true with all the organs in the body. So each organ has a different voltage
Okay.
and ampere needed for it to operate,
Okay.
functionally. And since we're talking about the brain, when it comes to mental illness, we're talking about the frontal lobes, and we're talking specifically about the limbic system, which is the center of the frontal lobes. So it's a relatively small territory in the brain, but it has a huge effect. And the relay center where it starts in the frontal lobes is through the central retina, because it's just through the eyes where the sun comes. That signal is called the habennular nucleus. And the reason what makes that special, when when light comes in through your eye and hits your retina, there's a track goes to the supracosmatic nucleus, which is the clock in your head. It's the master clock on the body. There's no synapses, meaning there's no connections. It's a direct wire. The same thing is true with the habennular nucleus. So the habennular nucleus gets direct influence, just like the SCN does. The habennular nucleus that goes up into the frontal lobes and basically allows the frontal lobes to know what's going on in the environment around you, specifically when it's tied to light. And then the neural tracts, especially the mitochondria in those tracts, they liberate not only light, but they also liberate CO2 and water. If you think about those three metrics like an amplifier or equalizer knob, you're dialing up exactly what the connection is between you and the environment you're in. So if you have a bad connection, say there's too much water or too little water, or too
Mm,
much CO2 or too little CO2, or let's say you're living inside your life and you're not outside at all of those things give, different signals, and that ultimately affects not only your cognition, your consciousness, but also your mood, your emotions, and your overall mental health.
okay. Well, I mean, I think it's very succinct, like, again, like, in terms of, like, how it all works and works together, right? And I think, when, like, when people are having kind of, like, mitochondrial dysfunction, like, which mental health symptoms do you think people are going to kind of like, what are the earliest red flags that people are gonna see when they have mitochondrial dysfunction? Maybe it differs by person, but I'm just trying to think, like, is it, like, sleep or
I
anhedonia or, like, what do you think would be the first red flags?
think your question has even a more fundamental premise. You want to jump straight to G, F, and E in the alphabet when you need to start with this, that mitochondria are failing from the time you exit the vagina. So just realize something, that every decade you go out, you lose 10%
Mm,
your efficiency, and we call that heteroplasmy. And heteroplasmy percentage is directly tied to aging. So when you actually think about this, know that when a baby's born, they're a fat tub of goo. They float in the water. Their brain is not fully developed. Their brain in humans develops postnatally until about 25, 28 years old. So the goal is to take all that sub-Q fat, turn it into CO2 and water. And that actually is what helps fully develop the brain. That's when the brain case gets hard, full or
mm,
soft. But most mental illness, believe it or not, starts in those probably the first 7, 8 weeks in utero, and that's called transgenerational epigenetic changes that can lead to it. Those are some of the most severe ones. And then there's damage that happens postnatally, and that can happen as the nervous system is finished developing. The function is how bad those mitochondria are in those certain zip codes in your frontal lobe. So realize when you ask me this question, you've also assumed that your whole entire left frontal lobe has the same heteroplasm rate. That's not true. I'm going to tell you that each individual neural circuit, each individual nucleus, like we already talked about one nucleus, which is the bennular nucleus, every single circuit in you can have a different heteroplasm rate. That means that the equalizer knobs that are present when you're talking about mental illness is off the cheek, and it can happen very rapidly. This is why you have kids with mental disorders, at 6, 7, 8 years old. This is why some kids are born with autism. This is why some kids are born with bipolar disorder. Why? Because the deficit occurred in their germline. Mom and dad gave it to them, and the brain never developed normally in utero. And then when you put the baby out, say in a modern environment with iPads and screens and everything else around it, you kind of expect the brain to develop naturally, and it doesn't. Gladly, that's not the most common system. But that's how the system could go awry. So I think the first part of your question I need to understand, there is nothing that works linear or a slope of a line. Everything is stochastic. Everything is based on probability. Everything is based on the changes in mitochondria in different circuits. It could be in the proximal circuit and the central retinal pathways is great, but the distal circuits are bad. So when you have that understanding, that's when you truly understand that you're on a spectrum, mental disorders. Now, the most common symptom that you asked me about is probably a sleep disorder. That's the number one most common disruption. But are there many others? Yeah, photophobia is one. Another one is their pupillary reaction to light. I check pupils as a neurosurgeon. I just don't use a regular flashlight. I use different color lights to see if there's a different change. Why? Because people respond differently to blue light, red light, and then white LED light. And that gives me a clue of what's going on in those distal circuits. People with mental disorders tend to have much bigger pupils than people that don't.
Mm,
That's
wow.
not something that's, well talked about in medical schools. Why? Because big pharma doesn't want you doctors to know this stuff. Because if you did, you would likely prescribe, what's behind me, which is nature outside, instead of, uh, one of the drugs that they produce. So you need to understand that mental illness is a casino game. The drugs that they use are really not effective at treating these disorders. Mental disorders really have become more common in the last 50 years. Why? Because we now live in an artificial environment. Most people are addicted to tech screens. They're inside, they're not outside. And people don't realize how this has had a huge effect on how the brain grows the first, 28 years of life. And it's gotten so bad in the last 50 years that we are now seeing kids that are born with high heteroplasmy in the frontal lobes and they get mental disorders right off the bat. The most common ones are ADHD and OCD, which was obsessive compulsive disorder. Those are the ones that are the most common. And this is the reason why, if you talk to, I think, most kids under 25 old, I think the last number I saw is over 90% of those kids have been offered a prescription for Ritalin by a pediatrician.
Holy cow.
That's crazy. And that wasn't like that when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I was never offered, that prescription. But I can tell you that my son and my daughter, they were offered those prescriptions by pediatricians. And that tells you a couple of things. It could mean the doctors are crazy now, or the patients are more apt to have mental disorder because the environment has changed. And that's the key thing. The key thing that Big Pharma wants you all to believe is that the defect is in you. And what am I here to tell you? It's exactly the opposite. The defect is actually in the environment that we create. And what does that do? That leads to changes in the neurologic system that give you mental illness. And then through marketing, through propaganda, Big Pharma has you believe that, the defect is in you. And that's just not the case. If you put somebody who's a human, even with severe mental disorder, and you put them in nature, you can see massive improvements. And are there papers now in the literature that actually say that? The answer is yes. Now, obviously, if somebody's horribly bipolar and you put them out in nature in the tropics, they'll get better. And I mean better, slightly better, but you may not reverse the disease unless you do everything right. And when someone has a mental disorder, getting them to do everything correct, like they should, is a tour de force, but it's important, and I think it's really important for decentralized doctors to get the message out to people that suffer with these things, to tell them the truth because they've been lied to for so long. I mean, the bullshit that's present in the centralized system on these diseases is off the chart. And, we have a saying in decentralized medicine, the amount of energy that we have to put in to combat bullshit is logarithmic, because our message is completely against what big pharma is trying to sell to people. And remember, you have screens, you have TVs, you have Subway ads telling you, hey, take, Zoloft, take, Prozac. This is what you really need. And when we tell people, hey, sun is basically a cornucopia of a compound pharmacy that your frontal lobes need, that message doesn't resonate because the way people react now, they want action from a tweet. They want their mental disorder fixed, they want me to explain all of quantum biology to them in one tweet. And it's just a ridiculous barrier. That's part of the reason why change has come very slow to the mental illness space.
As you're talking about it, like, it is wild, like, how disconnected we are from the things that make us human, right? Like you said, and I've listened to you talk many times about how our bodies and our minds are really designed perfectly for a lot of these things that we've actually been again, we don't go outside. We don't engage with our friends or family. We don't eat foods that are normative to our environment. We don't all these things have been affected by, whether it's stuff in the water, the logical stuff, the screens, the exposure of all these things to people, and I don't think we realize the impact on the brain, the ability because like you said, these are patterns in the brain and these are also like different, the wiring centers of the brain and they were designed for, a world that we in a lot of ways, we don't inhabit very easily anymore in 2025 United States. I mean, I live in New York where the sun doesn't shine most of the time, and I was gonna ask you because we get people, like, obviously with and I don't know, I'd love to, like, hear your thoughts about, like, this obviously, we have the seasonal affective thing, that's what people will call it. I'm not saying that that's even correct, but for people that live in an altitude or a latitude, I'm sorry, where the light exposure, our ability to get like UVB rays, UV, like the for vitamin D and things like what I guess what is your advice for people besides just being able to get out every 6 weeks? Like it'd be nice to go to Aruba. I'd like to do that, but like in Buffalo, where hope goes to die sometimes. You know, um, I'm just wondering what your advice is, on how to maintain the right types of light in an environment where the sun doesn't shine a lot.
Well, again, it goes back to the question that you brought up earlier. It depends on the severity of the situation. Most people who already have seasonal affective disorder or bipolar disorder, they have a pretty severe problem. So it's incumbent upon them if they realize that they want a reversal disease, they're not a tree. They need to pick up and leave Buffalo. Why? Because that's a disease that's not going to get better there. It's the same thing that's true in Norway and Sweden and Finland, who have the highest incidence and prevalence of these diseases. Now, once you fix the problem, can you go back to those places and watch the Bills lose, more Super Bowls? Yep, you can do that. But what I think people need to really, really embrace is that people that just have bad moods, say in the wintertime, those are the people that I think can take the trip to Aruba and magically they'll say, wow, I feel better. People we're talking about are the people that have hardcore mental disorders. You cannot get well in the same environment that got you sick.
Mm,
And this is a very, very counterintuitive and hardcore message for people to hear because one of the things I want to make sure you understand and the audience understands is the brain responds to the environment, then it changes its wiring. So what does that mean? If you stay in that environment, the wiring is not going to change. So what you need to change is the wiring, and it's the light that fundamentally doesn't. So if you can't get that light in the environment, that's why you have a duty to yourself to say, okay, it's time to go. Now, here's the beauty of the human brain. When you put it back in the environment, it will respond to the new light signals that you give it, and it will unwire the bullshit so that you can rewire back to your full potential. And that's why I said, when you do that, you actually can move back to Norway, Sweden, to Finland, and to Buffalo if you really want to. But I think the other problem that you need to really understand is that the modern environment has changed. Like, for example, Buffalo is heavily geoengineered. So even if you go back to Buffalo, are you really going back to Buffalo or are you really going back to a polar north? I would submit to you that you're really going back to a much higher latitude than even Buffalo is. Why? Because of the actions of the government. Then when you think about the effect of technology, you're young enough to know that most people today spend 90, 95% of their time indoors. Why? Technology has brought us indoors and doesn't bring us outside. So I'm basically painting for you a really nasty little picture that even if you do go outside in Buffalo, you still are not getting full quantum yield of the environment. Plus, you've got 5G antennas, you've got UHF antennas, you've got, radio antennas all around you. And I know you don't know this and your audience doesn't know this, but what does that fundamentally do? It actually destroys melanin in the brain. When melanin gets destroyed, remember what I told you, that affects the DC electric current in your brain. So, what did we say is the basis of cognition, consciousness, and mental disorders? It's that DC current. And that DC current turns out it has to be really honed with precision. It's quantum mechanical. What does that mean? That any degree that it's off means that your signaling in your brain's off. In other words, if you really want to get rid of that bipolar disorder, it's going to be really difficult to do in an environment that doesn't give you any light stability. And Buffalo, for example, defines no light stability. And I can prove that to you really easily. This time of the year, it's staying light in Buffalo much longer than it does on December 21st. December 21st probably gets dark where you are about 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, the summer solstice on June 21st, sometimes it'll stay late where you are until 10 o'clock at night, 10:30 at night. Well, if you think about the swing in 6 months, that you go from 10:30 to 3:30 when the sun sets, that defines light asymmetry. And it turns out the higher you go up on the planet, the worse it is. That's the reason why the disorder called SAD actually happens in high latitude people. That's where it comes from. And
No.
it's been present with us for really long time. Why? Because to be quite frank with you, humans are not designed to live at the highest latitudes. In fact, to prove this to you, photosynthesis has a pretty sharp cutoff. When you get to the 59th latitude, it stops. So if you understand that life forms that are planted in the ground have a sharp cutoff, that's why we have the boreal forest that goes around the northern hemisphere. It turns out with us, we also have an evolutionary history that is very interesting to think about when we have this kind of conversation. Nearest cousins, not the chimps now, this is going to be the Neanderthals. They're called Neanderthals because we found most of their skeletons in the valley of Neander, which is at the 51st latitude in Germany.
Mm.
So I want you to do a hard stop. The reason they're not on the planet is because when they went 51 and above, they had 125 grams more brain tissue than we did, and that was not good enough. So what did they do? They stayed 51 below. They shared their genes with humans who had 125 grams less brain tissue, found it much more advantageous to go to higher latitudes. But you have to realize, what am I telling you? Humans are in the danger zone between 51 and probably 60. And when you begin to think about that, then you start to look at Buffalo from a very unique perspective. You start to go, Buffalo is higher up, closer to it. You live in a country where non-native meat is used. Could this fundamentally be the reason why most of the sports teams there haven't done well? Could this be the reason why Jim Kelly got the cancer he got? Because remember, when he got drafted, this a very interesting story. He went to play for the Houston Gamblers, and he famously, for those of people who are not Buffalo Bill fans, they may not know this. He played at the University of Miami. He's a Southerner, and he said the one team he didn't want to go to was the Buffalo Bills. Obviously,
Mm.
his career was very famous. He did very well. Went to 4 Super Bowls, lost all of them. But all of your famous players in the biggest games didn't play optimally. And I would tell you, if you look at who they lost to teams lower latitudes. And
Yeah.
it was very, very consistent across the board. The same thing with the Sabres. The Sabres have struggled with the same thing. And if you're a hockey fan, since you do live in Buffalo, I'd point this out just so you guys know I'm not picking on Buffalo. Toronto Maple Leafs, who's very close to you, hasn't won the cup since 1967. In fact, no team in Canada has won the cup I think since 93 or 94. So you got to start to ask yourself, why is it in the modern life that this stuff is starting to happen? It's because technology has boomed since the mid-90s. And technology actually makes the margin of safety for mental illness much, much lower. And this is the reason why that my message to people is very inconvenient. Why? Because big tech has done a really good job. of addicting us all to this technology. Why? Because blue light lowers your dopamine level, which makes it much more likely you're going to have a mental illness problem. The incidence and prevalence of all mental diseases in the United States has gone tremendously up. That's also true in Europe. The interesting thing that you should know, this is not true inside the tropics. The tropics have seen no increase at all. In fact, in many places, has seen a decrease. And when you begin to see that effect, and say you do have one of these disorders that you're interested in, I would submit to you that it makes far more sense for you to probably relocate for 1, 2, 3, or 4 years, leave the Zoloft at home and see how nature treats you. Because if you start to notice that when you get light stability and you're able to rewire your brain, you're able to put, you know, alpha MSH, melanin, POMC working in your brain, and those neural tracks come online, your friends and family may say, hey, you're a different person, when you go down there. And we're starting to notice this as a difference because you have to realize that one of the problems with all the drugs that Big Pharma uses for these diseases, they're also associated with tremendous collateral damage. The amount of suicide that's linked to people on these SSRIs are off the chart. So you got to start to ask yourself the question, why are these papers out there that people who have mental disorders come to the tropics or go camping and magically within 2 weeks their sleep improves, their mood improves, they start to get better? You don't have any papers out there like that about Zoloft. You don't have any papers out there with any pharmaceutical drug. They tell you that you have to be on them sometimes for the rest of your life. And you
Yeah.
have to realize that's part of the game. That's part of the casino game. They are not interested in reversals. They're interested in turning you into a lifelong customer.
Well, and that's something, and when I talk to people about medication, right, because people come in and, people come into my practice and they wanna be on medication, and I think that it's pretty consistent with the fact that because I've heard people, I've heard doctors to say, like, "Well, they'll tell patients, "Well, you're gonna be on this for the rest of your life," and I know that I think the statistic, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the statistic is at any given point, the compliance for medication is usually 50%. So these people, even if they're I mean, it's not something that human beings really, like, consistently wanna do anyway. And like you said, there's all of these other factors that people are not aware of. But I think it's fascinating. I can think of a family member that actually did exactly what you said, that they went to some place, in the tropics, and they had a ridiculously different experience, and explained to them, I said, "Well, you said that you feel so much differently. Why didn't you stay?" They said, "Well, I just couldn't." And I'm like, "But you all of your mental health stuff that you had," and this person had really bad, like, OCD, obsessive anxiety, that they couldn't even focus, right? And then it just was not even they weren't there for very long. They were there for a very short amount of time, and they were shocked by it, but I don't think they were ever, and at the time, I was more ignorant than I am now, and I did not understand, like, the effect of all of these other factors that you're talking about. But it is a hard sell for people who have been marketed that this is the only way. The only way is take this pill. And the only way is like you said, to be a consumer, a customer for them. And again, I think people are well-intentioned sometimes, some people are obviously not.
I don't think they're well intentioned at all, to be
No,
quite
I
frank.
know, I'm not disagreeing with that. I mean, I'm just saying, like, I think sometimes the patients don't know what to do though, right? And I think it's
Well,
hard.
I think the patients don't know what to do because they're mentally ill. But the
Yeah,
bottom line is when they have a good effect, it should be blatantly obvious that they need to stay there, and that's when their family needs to step in. But here's the problem. People that have mental illness have huge anchors in their life. Most of the time it's families. And to be quite honest with you, most people are mentally ill. Their families are sick and tired of dealing with it. Why? Because they're a real hassle to deal with. And the real issue is they need to stay down there. Like families need to hear this message, send their people down there and let them stay. Because the longer they stay, the better they get. And then guess what? When they get enough of the resolution power in their brain, then all of a sudden the signal changes on the phone calls. Hey, you know what? I don't think I want to come home. I think I'm gonna think about building a life, down here. Or you know what? I'm gonna move from Buffalo. I think I'm gonna go to Miami. And because I'm better now, but I need to come back to the United States. I'm leaving Central America. I'm leaving Mexico, but I'm not going to harm myself anymore. I understand what's going on. And when you see that, that's kind of when the family needs to go all in again. Why? Because that's a person that can get completely better. I think the real problem for this topic is when people are really, really sick and, to the point where they're getting electric shock therapy or they're actually close to suicide or harming themselves, that's when the decisions are really tough. And that's when, unfortunately, some of the family, you almost need to treat them like a child and you need to keep them down where they need to be and give them no quarter. Ultimately, it's no different than what I tried to tell you earlier. When that baby comes out of its mother's vagina, is 80% fat, the brain has to develop. And someone has mental disorder, that's exactly what the story is like again. And people don't really understand that your 28-year-old, your 45-year-old, your 62-year-old needs that level of attention, and you have to be ready to do it. And let's be frank, with money failing in the United States, this becomes a tour de force. And do I understand that this is a very inconvenient message? Yeah, but I try to tell people without your health, you really have nothing. Money doesn't matter if you're severely mentally ill, because the next step really is going to be either really big harm to you or you're going to be institutionalized in some government place where you basically just get locked in a box and they forget about you. It's an unfortunate situation that's built, but I hate to say it, it's a prison of our own design. Why? Because we're all addicted to the thing that makes these diseases worse.
Hey, we're Dan and Shannon Lawson.
And we're the hosts of Marriage Sparks by Hearts Renewed.
I'm a marriage therapist.
And I'm his very real, very honest wife. We've had our fair share of fights, breakthroughs, and awkward moments at the kitchen table.
That's why we started this daily micro podcast for just 10 minutes a day that's packed with real tools, stories from the therapy chair,
and wisdom from everyday life and marriage. Some funny, some hard, all real.
Because your marriage doesn't need more pressure. It just needs more sparks.
So tune in with us every day for connection, clarity, and a little bit of hope. Just click the link in the show notes to start listening today.
And I think that's a bigger issue to discuss, probably with people out there, because they really fundamentally need to understand that changing their environment is the first step in getting better. The next step is the key questions you brought up earlier. Well, Jack, how long? There's no way of telling that because it depends how deep the hole is and how bad, the neural deficits are. I mean, I guesstimate after doing a full neurologic exam on people, going through all their cranial nerves and seeing what the status is of their neural tracts, we can make a guesstimate. And I can tell you, those with the severest mental illness, what I tell them when I see them, looking at 3 to 5 years inside the tropics. Why? That's how long it takes to rebuild the aromatic amino acids that make up all the neurotransmitters. But the number one defect that these people have is they have a melanin defect inside their brains. And the melanin is critical to developing the DC electric current. And that's actually what electric shock does. And actually works by just the same like AAA works. When your car doesn't start in Buffalo, you come out and jump it and you're good to go. That lasts for a while, but what happens when you're mentally ill? You don't have a good battery to begin with, so you have nothing to hold the charge. So this is something that has to happen over and over again. If you look at the literature, this is the most irony about this disease is that electric shock therapy to date still has the best track record. That should wake doctors up. Why? Because if you can't hold that electric charge, you don't have melanin, it tells you it's a photobioelectric story. It's not a pharmaceutical story. And that's actually what people don't get. And when you can convince them to get in the sun, don't wear sunscreen and don't wear sunglasses, try not to wear contact lenses, then magically, guess what happens? They start to get better and they look at themselves like, Jesus, I'm not crazy. I just feel crazy when I'm in Buffalo. Or I just feel crazy when I'm in Copenhagen. Or I just feel crazy when I'm in, Finland. And when somebody gets to that level of cognition that they begin to understand that they can control the motherboard of their computer inside their head, that's a game changer. That's when you know that these people are going to get better. And it's really hard for the parents and the family to hear this. Why? Because they've been told all this shit before by centralized doctors with the drugs. Oh, we can just give them this, we can give them that, and they'll be fine. That's not true. I mean, all you have to do, as you said before, this is a 55% failure rate with these medications. So if you're starting out at a 55% failure rate, I tell my people this, that why would you ever start with a B, C, or D when you have an A available? If you have one of these diseases, you should immediately go to the A and not look back. And the problem is, do not worry about how long it takes you to get better, because ultimately when you do get better, then you can refigure out your life again. It's almost like being reborn. It's almost like a rebirth. And then you go from there. Then you decide what you want to do. But when you're sick, especially with this type of brain disorder, it is imperative on you doing the first step correctly. And that first step is always getting in a correct environment.
I mean, I think that that's a huge thing for people to understand the mechanisms, like, as you're explaining them, and I appreciate the analogy of the car battery too, because I think people can then connect to, like, what we're talking about, but the mechanisms of how the body works and a lot of things that people have never been exposed to professionally or in their treatment histories because like you said, like there is just this only one agenda, one treatment option. And it's not even necessarily like we just talked about, like yeah, if you have an option to do something that's going to repair you on a cellular level, it's going to heal you on a cellular, like you said, or the brain track or the neurological tracks of the brain. Why would people not be interested in that? And like you said, that's probably a whole nother conversation about, like,
Well, I
why
think it
that's
is.
happening.
Yeah, I think it is another conversation. I think this conversation is kind of important for the person with the disease and their immediate family members that, are having to deal with this to understand this is the first step. And once you commit to that first step, I tell people just take the person 3 to 6 months, put them in a good environment. And my analogy is just the coconut. I said, your family member's a coconut, and right now you're trying to grow coconut trees in Buffalo. That doesn't work. So take the coconut, put it down in the tropics, and watch what happens. And magically, when it happens, and they start to see a different version of their family member who's not as crazy as they used to be, they kind of look at you like, this is amazing, because you begin to see that the defect isn't in the person. You begin to start to understand that the mitochondria are electromagnetic antennas, and they're designed to connect us from the environment to the colony inside of us so that that colony creates all the right electrical signals, because that's what this is. It's an electrical signaling problem. Effectively, when people tell me, hey, Jack, you're a quantum biologist, you're not really a neurosurgeon, to be really honest with you, I think I'm more of an electrical engineer that understands biology really well.
Well, but I think that's really a lot of times people will say, they're chemically imbalanced. They're chemically imbalanced, and that's why they need Prozac, and they're chemically imbalanced, and that's why they need Abilify, or that they're
Yeah,
chemically
but guess what?
imbalanced.
All those drugs are not in you. They have no evolutionary basis in humans. Just remember that.
Mhm.
These are chemicals that Rockefeller medicine makes to give you that's so somehow supposed to replace what you're designed to make naturally. This is crazy talk.
Yeah.
You want to know the truth? That's a bigger mental illness than the ones we're talking about. And that's the one that we have to fight, because the way this works is certain frequencies of light tied to those aromatic amino acids that make the chemicals. Those are the chemicals that your people will know, like dopamine, norepinephrine, GABA. But most people don't even get told that these chemicals all have an absorption and emission spectra for light. When you hear that for the first time, you go, well, what happens if you don't get that light? Well, then you don't make that chemical. There's your chemical imbalance. Turns out your chemical imbalance really is a light imbalance. The light in Buffalo doesn't, it's not equivalent to the light in El Salvador. Very simple. And it never did. That's the reason why you've had this disease your life long. And you think that you were doing good by going to Buffalo Sabre games and watching the Bills on TV. And it turns out that made you more mentally ill. So when you really understand that how the system is designed to work from a photobioelectric standpoint, and you don't have to know a lot of science, you just have to understand the big 100,000-foot idea down, go, well, I didn't know that, amino acids have a specific spectrum. I had no idea. That means the amino acids that make up all these neurotransmitters have the same effect. Well, that's kind of interesting. And when you start to tell people that, like dopamine, the chemical we've been talking about, has a strict UV absorption pattern, well, do a hard stop. Tell me, my friend in Buffalo, when do you get UV light? Maybe 3 months out of the year. That's it. So you understand why it's more common there than it is where I live down in El Salvador? There's your answer. I mean, it's pretty simple. And the thing is, then people will say to you, hey, Jack, can I go to the pet store and buy a snake light or a reptile light and use that for Metco? Well, again, that's another solution that is B, C, or D. Now, ironically, I'm going to tell you something you're probably shocked at. If you used a purple and red light in your house, is that better than Abilify and Zoloft? Probably. Can I get some ice and some Pellegrino? Thank you. And, when you hear that kind of remark, you start to go, well, I only need to buy one red light, one reptile light. I'm going to give this a shot. Like, say, if you're one of those people that, don't have a family that can help you out, you could try them. And I'd be okay with you trying that at home before you try, using the drugs. And if you start to notice this is crazy, I'm actually getting better. Then the next step is, okay, now I need to do everything I can to get to a better environment, because you know what? I'm not interested in being sick anymore. I really like to reverse this problem, functionally. And, for many people who are, let's just say their toe is in the pool sick, you can do small amounts of things to move the needle a big way. The people that are really sick, the people that are close to institutionalization, no, they're going to need something way more than that. Why? Because the hole that they're coming from is a much bigger hole.
I just think that is a powerful thing, though, going back to what you said, I didn't wanna stop you with it when you said about how it's not a chemical imbalance, it's a light imbalance, that
It
people
is.
don't understand how the brain operates and how
It's
we
actually
have
not how the
different.
brain operates. It's actually how the neurochemicals in the brain are made. They're made from aromatic amino acids. And what you need to know, when I say the word aromatic amino acids, I don't want you to run away and cry like a little girl. I want you to understand what it means. It means it absorbs UV light. So
Mm,
do a hard stop. Now think about what we said in this podcast already. Everybody gets SAD, everybody gets depression. What do they tend to not have? UV light.
yeah.
So guess what? You don't have a chemical imbalance. You have a light imbalance because you can't make the chemicals because the light is not in your environment.
So again, like, I get like, one of the questions I had, I have a couple of questions about this. One of them is in a practical way, like in a very practical way for people who are not going to leave Buffalo
Agreed.
just yet. Like for people that are dealing with just, the lack of light in the winter time, or like you said, the 10 months that it's not here. What do you recommend them to do? Is it the reptile light? To get the right spectrums of light for the aromatic amino acid,
You get some of it. You get some of it that you're not getting from the environment. Do I think it's a reasonable first step? Yeah, you can try it. But am I going to advocate that as a doctor? No, I'm always going to tell you to go for the A. Now,
mhm.
remember, you, as the person with the disease, no one is holding your feet to the fire. Can you try it? Is it safer for you to do that than it is to use the drugs? There's no question about it. It's not. If it wasn't the case, why the hell would they sell reptile lights in Petco? Why do they sell red lights on Amazon? They're there so you can try and use it. I mean, I hope everybody that listens to this thinks that this is crazy time. But then guess what? When you give crazy a chance, you may find out that shit, this guy knows what he's talking about. And then the key is, what am I going to do? I'm going to send you to the place where the light's the best. And that turns out it's inside the tropics. That's where you want to be. And the key for you when you go to the tropics, what's the real answer? How much do you move the needle and how short a time? Because that tells you how deep the hole is. That allows me then to tell you how long it's going to take for you to get better. Got it? That's the key. That's the part that no one knows. That's the reason why going there is important. If you use the reptile light or use the photobiomodulation red light, I can never tell you that. Why? Because the spectrum on those lights are very narrow. They introduce flicker. Flicker actually makes a lot of mental diseases worse. For example, autism, OCD, ADHD, they're horribly affected by flicker. So is schizophrenia. So you have to realize if you're using a suboptimal tool, I know you're going to get a suboptimal result. You don't. But am I okay with people at high latitudes who don't have money to try these things because they're still better than the drugs? The answer is yes. Then when you do get the answer and you say, God, this did move the needle for me,
Yeah.
that's when you have to go to the next level and say, look, enough with the reptile lights, enough with the PBM. I'm going to Cancun. I'm going to El Salvador. I'm going, to Ecuador. I'm going somewhere for 3 to 6 months in an Airbnb, and I'm going to sit at the beach with my feet in the water, the Playmate cooler, drinking water. I'll get an umbrella over me, but I'm going to keep going out and back in the sun. And I'm going to see if this has an impact on my mental health. And if it does, then here's the beautiful thing. You got an answer. You didn't need to go talk to a shrink on a couch. Your shrink is in the sky right above. And all you need to do is have a relationship with that master. That's the person I want you to talk to every day. And the more you do it, I think the better you get. And you'll start noticing one of the really interesting things is people who have bipolar disorder tend to have heavy incidents of hypothyroidism and also diabetes. Guess what? Both of those diseases are also helped by solar power. So you start to go to yourself, wait a minute. The same pathways that cause these other diseases are affected in bipolar disorder. What does that tell you? There's a brownout in those neural tracks. When you're able to fix the brownout, magically they all get better. So the number one leading mitochondrial researcher in the world, named Doug Wallace, has come up with a theory about 10, 15 years ago that as you get in the right environment, the heteroplasmy rate comes down as fast as you got the disease can vanish right away. So guess what? That's how you reverse these diseases.
Wow. Wow, that's wild though. I mean, because a lot
It's
of
not
times when
really
people
wild
hear
when you understand quantum biology, because guess what? That's how we work. I mean, just think about think it's wild, but I want to take you back to something you know. A baby comes out of its mother, can't speak, it can't talk, it can't do shit. And literally, in 6 or 7 years, being outside the mother, going outside, what happens? Magically, it becomes a silly talking monkey. It's just shocking, right? But guess what happened? The environment changed from being drowned in a womb with an umbilical cord stuck to your belly. You become a terrestrial being in sunlight. That's
Mm,
all it took. And you know that what I just told you is axiomatically true about every person on this planet. And here you are arguing with me about this because I'm telling you to do the exact same thing again.
yeah. Yeah, that's wild though. Just because it is very that's I guess there's genius in the simplicity of the understanding of it all. But going back to what you said about the light specifically, that is really helpful for people to maybe tip the first domino for them to understand like what you're saying in terms of how these things are restored, how we restore the mind. And I think just that alone is hopeful for people so that they understand because people are not exposed to this. They're
I understand that, but I'm not interested in hope. I'm interested in the truth. I've
no,
always been interested in the truth, and I'm telling people that you need to realize you are subject to the rules of nature. And when you unplug from those rules, you get diseases like the ones you're asking me about today. The bottom line is all you need to do is to prove that you are a fabric in that quilt, is get back in the environment that you're designed to flourish. That's all you need to do. It's that easy. And then you can be smarter than the psychiatrist. You can be smarter than your primary care doctor. You can also be smarter than your brain surgeon.
well, I had one question that I didn't get to ask, but if I could ask you, one thing that's come up at times is people will tell me that like with sunlight, they'll talk about how sunlight or they get concerned about sunlight and the serotonin of sunlight somehow producing bipolar mania and different things like that. I was wondering if you could clarify that for me or like explain like I don't know if that's true or not. I mean,
No, well,
I
it's
just
not true, but I can explain it to you pretty easily. And then I'll give you a resource where you can go to read more about it. So I want you to think about someone with bipolar disorder
yeah,
or serotonin syndrome as a
okay.
house wired in Buffalo in 1920, and then the nuclear power plant opens up in 2025. You're going to hook up that 1920s house to the nuclear power plant supply, or will the house burn down?
It will
There's
probably
your answer. Because if you don't have the system, the wiring diagram correctly done in front of them, and then you all of a sudden give it this huge charge, there you go. So
yeah.
now, here's the second part of the question. This is the reason why on December 20th and June 21st, we have the highest emissions for mental disorders in ICUs all over ERs all over the world. Why? Because that's when light is most unstable at most environments. Most of the world's population lives at high latitudes. This is the reason we know about it. So realize something that when sunlight is strong or weak, the same thing happens about the nuclear power plant. I just gave you the same analogy because the sun is strongest at those times. Okay. Now, if you want to read about the nuance of what I just told you, where I'll split your head open and turn you in to black swan mitochondria on my Patreon blog, quantum engineering number 47 and number 48 tell you exactly how this happens. So
Mm,
literally, you sign up for the blog. It costs you $5 a month, but you can get rid of it. I don't make it expensive. I make it so that it's dirt cheap. If this information is not worth a cup of coffee for a month, then you've told me that you don't value me and I'm not really interested in dealing with you any further. But I can tell you everything that I have in my head about how this disease functionally works is in those two blogs. Now, you'll still have
mm.
questions when you read them, but I promise you, you'll get more information from those two blogs about bipolar disorder and depression and mania than you will from any psychiatrist that you'll ever meet. Why? Because I understand how the brain works. I'm a brain surgeon. Those guys, they're not brain surgeons. They never were. All they are is drug dealers for big pharma. That's it. And then after you read those, when you read it, then remember, you are the discerning public. You decide, is Jack more right or are the centralized psychiatrists more right? Because you know what their results are. You don't know what my results are. And when you see how I do things, you're going to see it's remarkably different than what they tell you. And most of what I've told you today in this hour is based in those books.
Well, yeah, I'm gonna take a look at it for sure. I think one of the things that I've always loved about the way that you will do things in some regard is that you always look at the, I guess, both diagnostically, but also at the pattern that is reflective of optimal functioning. And why is this pattern work? Why does this function versus this not? And so if you're looking for positive anomalies, I think that you find, like you said, the truth, because something I think William James used to say, the truth is what works. And I think that in a lot, we have to know certain things, not everything, like you said. We're not going to all. I'm sure we're not going to all master all these things, but the basic understanding of how these things work, how our bodies work, I think, is profoundly useful.
I'm going to make it even more subtle for you. It's funny. I don't have to
Open
teach
your
elephants
eyes
and
and
rhinoceros
focus
and
on
mice
my
pulling
color.
the pins.
Now
You know what they
find me
know?
on
They
Google
know what to
search.
do.
वहाँ मिलेंगे
And guess what?
offline
You
और
know what the
online
problem
सब
is?
offers.
Humans and
Deals in
gorillas have
stress
become
out. Shopping
centralized
का best kept
ideas,
secret है
right?
Google
And guess what?
search.
Therein lies the problem. Remember something. Nature is so simple that animals know what to do. The only animals that get the diseases that we get are the ones that are in the zoo in cities.
Mm.
Do not forget that. And the problem is, most of the people listening to this, you are a zoo animal. That's why you're
Fancy
interesting.
speakers. Where
What am I
from?
saying to
हजार
you?
stores देखे
I
होंगे
need you
यार.
to reinvent that you're best adapted to. Once you do that, you will stay away from centralized medicine.
Mm. I think I think I love that, the rewild yourself. I think that gives people like a mantra to engage with. Before we kind of cut out, is there anything specifically, if you were to tell somebody, or I don't know, maybe I guess like something that would be one of the primary things for them to maintain their mental health. Obviously it's like to be in the tropics, to get into the nature
No,
that their
no, it's
body was
simple.
designed.
It's simpler than that. There's number one thing that I say at the end of every podcast where people ask me, what is the number way to be healthy across the board, whether it's mental health or not? Never miss sunrise the rest of your life. Always, no matter where you are on the planet, go outside and see the sunrise. Doesn't matter if you see it, just let your eyes be out in nature to feel the color, temperature, and the frequency. If you do that, that's 80% of the ballgame.
Okay. Well, I think that's huge. I mean, that's made a profound impact on me. And like I tell, it's wild when I talk to people about your work, or I give them, either directions to the different interviews that you've done or the work that you have on your blog and different things, is they're shocked by how much different they feel in a way that they've never done, because these things, like again, they've never been exposed to these things that
They've been
really
exposed
are
to the
restored.
propaganda. They've been exposed to the propaganda of Rockefeller medicine. And you know what? It takes years of deprogramming. People don't look, you think it's easy to tell people, look, you've been brainwashed by the people that you trusted. I mean, the reason that my message resonates right now is think about what we just came through with COVID. Everybody knows they were full of shit. So guess what? Now everybody's like, okay, Jack is telling me that the Sphinx was put out there at the 28th latitude. Look into the east, with all grounded. And that's an ancient method. That's exactly what you need to do when you have the diseases you want to reverse. That's all you need to do.
Mm,
Start there.
wow. Yeah, well, thank you, sir. This has been a fantastic conversation. I mean, I feel like I got hit with a fire hose of a lot of different things. So I'll process this, obviously, but this has been a fantastic conversation. So thank you for your openness and your generosity with all of the knowledge that you've gathered over your life. So I'm sure that many people will, benefit from this. I can't wait to share it with the audience and continue to have people share this with other people to hopefully wake them up, to reality and opportunities to get into a state of health they didn't realize is possible.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, thank you.